Families tear themselves apart for money, but true wealth often hides in plain sight. Audrey expected nothing from her billionaire father's estate, yet her greedy siblings made sure she received an insulting, broken inheritance. They thought they won. They had no idea they just handed her the ultimate prize. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Hale and Croft law offices, blurring the sprawling grey skyline of downtown Chicago. Inside the mahogany-paneled boardroom on the top floor, the temperature felt even colder than the storm outside. Audrey Whitaker sat at the far end of a massive conference table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore a simple tailored navy dress, a stark contrast to the aggressive display of wealth surrounding her. To her left sat her older brother, Preston. He was the freshly minted acting CEO of Whitaker Logistics, currently checking his platinum Rolex Daytona, as if the reading of their father's last will and testament was a minor inconvenience cutting into his tea time. To her right sat Vivian, their middle sister, draped in a cream-colored Chanel suit that cost more than Audrey's entire annual salary as a freelance archivist. Vivian was busy tapping away on her phone, her perfectly manicured nails clicking rhythmically, completely unbothered by the solemn occasion. At the head of the table sat Marcus Hale, a senior partner whose billable hours could bankrupt a small country. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat, opening the thick, leather-bound portfolio that contained the final wishes of Harlan Whitaker. Harlan had been a titan of industry, a self-made logistics mogul who clawed his way up from the shipping docks of South Boston to build an empire worth an estimated $400 million. He was also a ruthless, calculating man who viewed his children not as family, but as investments. "If we are all ready," Hale began, his voice a dry, practiced monotone, "we shall proceed with the distribution of the estate of Harlan James Whitaker." Preston finally put his phone face down on the table, leaning forward with a predatory gleam in his eye. Vivian offered a polite, practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. Audrey merely nodded, a heavy knot forming in her stomach. She had not spoken to her father since she refused to marry the son of a rival shipping magnate to secure a corporate merger. Harlan had called her a failure. Audrey had called him a tyrant. She did not expect to win, but a small part of her, the part that still mourned the father he could have been, hoped for some final gesture of reconciliation. Hale began reading the asset allocations. The list was staggering. There were commercial real estate holdings in Manhattan, a sprawling equestrian estate in the Hamptons, heavily guarded offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and an art collection that had Sotheby's appraisers salivating. "To my eldest son," Hale read, his eyes scanning the dense legal text, "I leave 70% of the voting shares in Whitaker Logistics, along with the Manhattan penthouse on Central Park West, and the liquid assets held in the primary Chase private client accounts." Preston let out a slow, satisfied breath, sinking back into his plush leather chair. He had won. The empire was his. "Do it too." "To my daughter, Vivian," the lawyer continued, "I leave the Hamptons estate, the entirety of the modern art collection, the remaining 30% of the non-voting shares in the company, and the contents of the Swiss Asset Trust." Vivian's smile widened into a genuine triumphant smirk. She shot a fleeting, pitying glance toward Audrey. The room fell silent except for the drumming of the rain against the glass. Audrey felt the blood rushing in her ears. The major assets were gone. The money, the properties, the company, everything had been divided perfectly between the two siblings who had spent their lives sycophantically orbiting their father's wallet. Hale turned the heavy parchment page. He paused, looking over his glasses at Audrey. For a brief second, she thought she saw a flicker of sympathy in the old lawyer's eyes, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "And finally," Hale said, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave, "to my youngest daughter, Audrey, the child who always insisted on looking backward instead of forward, who valued the mechanics of the past over the profitability of the future." Audrey braced herself. "I leave my vintage Underwood Standard portable typewriter, currently resting on the desk in my primary study." Hale closed the folder with a soft thud. "That concludes the distribution of specific assets. The remainder of the estate's minor effects will be liquidated to cover probate taxes." Silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "A typewriter!" Preston barked, breaking the tension with a short, cruel laugh. "The old piece of junk that's been rusting in his office for decades. Are you kidding me?" "I assure you, Preston, I am reading verbatim from the notarized document," Hale replied flatly. Vivian cupped her mouth, feigning shock. "Oh, Audrey, I am so sorry. I suppose Daddy never really forgave you for walking away from the family business. If you need a little loan to cover your rent this month, just let my assistant know." Audrey's hands trembled, but she forced her jaw to remain clenched. It was not about the money. It was the public humiliation, the final calculated slap in the face from a man reaching out from the grave just to prove he always had the last word. An antique, broken typewriter. It was less than nothing. It was an insult. "I do not need your money, Vivian," Audrey said, her voice remarkably steady despite the storm raging inside her. She stood up, smoothing the front of her dress. "Mr. Hale, how do I take possession of the item?" "My staff has already retrieved it from the estate," Hale said, gesturing to a heavy canvas-covered shape sitting on a side table near the door. "You are free to take it with you today." Preston stood up, buttoning his bespoke suit jacket. "Well, if that is all, I have a board meeting to run. Have fun playing secretary, little sister." Without another word, Preston and Vivian swept out of the room, leaving behind the lingering scent of expensive cologne and profound betrayal. Audrey walked over to the side table and pulled back the canvas. There it sat, the vintage Underwood Standard. It was incredibly heavy, made of solid cast iron and coated in decades of dust and neglect. The black enamel was chipped. The circular keys were tarnished, and the carriage was locked tight with rust. It was a completely useless relic. Audrey grabbed the heavy leather handle of its carrying case, the weight of it pulling her shoulder down, and walked out into the freezing Chicago rain, entirely alone. The reality of Audrey's situation settled in with crushing weight. Her small, drafty apartment in Rogers Park was overflowing with unpaid bills. Her freelance archiving work had dried up, and without the small, silent trust fund stipend her father had previously allowed her to maintain, she was rapidly approaching financial ruin. Every time she opened her phone, she was bombarded by news articles about her siblings. "Preston Whitaker secures $2 billion merger," read one headline in the Wall Street Journal. "Vivian Whitaker hosts star-studded Hamptons Gala," read a society page on page 6. They were thriving, parading their inherited wealth, while Audrey was contemplating selling her winter coat to pay the heating bill. Through it all, the Underwood typewriter sat on her cheap laminate kitchen table, mocking her. It was an ugly, brutalist piece of machinery. Every time Audrey looked at it, she felt a fresh wave of resentment toward her father. She had tried to sell it to an antique dealer in the Loop, hoping to get a few $100s to cover groceries. The dealer had taken one look at the rusted carriage, the missing ribbon, and the jammed type bars, and offered her $30. He told her it would cost more to restore it than it was worth. Out of sheer stubborn pride, she had refused the offer and lugged the 40-pound iron beast back up the 4 flights of stairs to her apartment. On a bleak evening, the power in her apartment flickered and died. The utility company had finally made good on their threats, plunging her into darkness with only the ambient amber glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. Audrey lit a single pillar candle and sat at the kitchen table. She stared at the typewriter. Her father was a monster, but he was a meticulous monster. He never did anything without a reason. Why this specific item? He had a multi-million-dollar collection of vintage cars, rare coins, and first-edition books. Why leave her an object that was not only worthless, but practically destroyed? "You valued the mechanics of the past over the profitability of the future," she whispered, echoing the words of his will. Mechanics. Audrey stood up, walked to her small toolkit in the hallway closet and pulled out a flashlight, a can of WD-40, and a set of precision screwdrivers. If she was going to freeze in the dark, she might as well see what was so special about this hunk of metal. She started with the exterior, spraying a lubricant onto the rusted joints of the carriage return. She grabbed a microfiber cloth and began scrubbing away the grime that coated the glass-topped keys. The letters began to shine under the beam of her flashlight. T-U-W-E-R-T-Y. It was standard, boring. She pressed the A key. It would not budge. She pressed harder, putting her body weight into it until, with a loud snap, the metal type bar flew forward and struck the platen roller. The sound was incredibly loud in the silent apartment. She realized the machine was not just rusted, it had been deliberately jammed. Small, nearly invisible steel pins had been wedged between the type bars beneath the ribbon cover. Frowning, Audrey used a pair of needle-nose pliers to extract the pins one by one. Someone had gone through a lot of trouble to ensure this machine could not be typed on. But why? After an hour of meticulous work, her hands stained black with ancient grease and ink, she finally freed the carriage. It slid to the left with a harsh, grinding screech. That was when she noticed the platen, the heavy rubber roller that the paper wraps around. It was unusually thick, and the rubber was cracked and peeling at the edges. But it was not just rubber. As Audrey rotated the roller, she saw a gleam of metal catching the candlelight through a crack in the casing. Her heart began to race. She grabbed her flathead screwdriver and jammed it into the crack, prying the hardened, degraded rubber away. It flicked off in brittle chunks, falling onto the table. Beneath the rubber exterior, the roller was not made of standard solid wood or metal tubing. It was a hollow cylinder made of polished steel, completely sealed at both ends. Audrey inspected the ends of the cylinder. On the right side, where the manual turning knob usually sat, there was a tiny, intricate keyhole, disguised as a simple screw head. She sat back, her breath caught in her throat. A hidden safe disguised as a typewriter part. But where was the key? She scoured the carrying case, shook the machine, and checked the floor. Nothing. She looked back at the keyboard. The keys were finally free. She grabbed a blank sheet of paper from her desk, fed it into the exposed steel roller, which somehow still gripped the paper well enough, and began to test the keys. She typed the alphabet: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. The letters struck the paper through the dry, faded ribbon. They were faint, but readable, except for 3 letters, the O, the N, and the E. Whenever she struck those keys, the type bars did not reach the paper. They stopped abruptly. hitting a block hidden deep within the belly of the machine. ONE1. She flipped the heavy typewriter upside down, resting it on its carriage. She grabbed her Phillips head screwdriver and began rapidly unscrewing the heavy cast-iron base plate. There were 6 screws, rusted tight, requiring her to use every ounce of her strength to break them loose. Finally, the heavy metal plate dropped away, exposing the complex, oily underbelly of levers and springs. Tucked precisely beneath the mechanism for the O, N, and E keys was a small, flat, brass lock box, welded directly to the frame. The type bars were striking it, which is why they would not print. Attached to the front of this brass box was a small combination dial, no bigger than a dime. It had 3 numbers. Audrey's mind raced. 3 numbers. Her father's birthday? No, too obvious. Her birthday? August 12th. She carefully rotated the tiny dials with the tip of her screwdriver. 8. 1. 2. She tugged at the brass latch. Nothing. She thought about her father. What did he value? What was the one sequence of numbers he worshipped? The founding date of Whitaker Logistics. October 4th, 1978. No, that was 4 digits. She closed her eyes, remembering the reading of the will. To my youngest daughter, Audrey, who valued the mechanics of the past, I passed the Underwood typewriter. She leaned in close, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the freezing apartment. She turned the tiny dial. 9. 2. 2. With a soft, metallic click that sounded louder than thunder in the quiet room, the brass box sprang open. Inside, resting on a bed of faded red velvet, were 2 items. The first was a heavy, ornate silver key, distinctly antique, but featuring a modern, laser-cut magnetic strip along its edge. It was the key to the platen cylinder. The second was a small leather-bound notebook. Audrey's hands shook as she reached for the silver key. She slid it into the disguised keyhole on the side of the steel roller and turned it. The end cap of the cylinder popped off. Inside the hollow tube was a tightly rolled sheaf of legal documents printed on thick, watermarked paper. She unrolled them under the candlelight. They were bearer bonds, but not just any bearer bonds. They were sovereign debt bonds from the government of Luxembourg, completely untraceable, legally immune to U.S. probate taxes, and worth $100 million. But that was not the twist. Audrey opened the small leather notebook. It was her father's handwriting, cramped and aggressive. The first page read, "If you are reading this, Audrey, you figured out the puzzle. You always were the smartest of the 3, even if you lacked killer instinct. By now, Preston and Vivian think they have won the world. They think they own an empire. What they do not know is that Whitaker Logistics is a rotting corpse. I have spent years operating massive, illegal shell games to keep the company afloat. The SEC has been investigating me. The warrants are sealed, but they are coming. The properties are heavily mortgaged. The company's stock is worthless. The offshore accounts Vivian inherited are honeypots monitored by the FBI. I left them the poison. I left them the fall. You, my disappointing, brilliant daughter, get the only clean money I have left. The bonds in the cylinder are yours, untraceable, untouchable. Watch them burn, Audrey, and enjoy your inheritance." Audrey stared at the ink on the page, the amber light of the candle reflecting in her wide eyes. The cold apartment suddenly did not feel so cold anymore. Her siblings had not inherited an empire. They had inherited an active bomb, and she was holding the only parachute. The financial world witnessed one of the most spectacular corporate collapses in modern American history. It began on a crisp morning. Preston Whitaker was standing at the head of the boardroom table, the exact spot where his father used to hold court, pitching a hostile takeover of a regional freight network to a room full of skeptical investors. He was mid-sentence, boasting about the Whitaker legacy of aggressive expansion when the heavy oak doors were violently shoved open. A dozen men and women in dark windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters FBI and SEC poured into the room. Preston's confident smirk vanished, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed expression as a senior agent slapped a federal warrant onto the polished mahogany table. The charges were staggering: wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, falsifying public records, and orchestrating a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme designed to inflate shipping margins. As the agents ordered the executives to step away from their computers and began seizing hard drives, Preston was unceremoniously handcuffed in front of his peers, the metallic click echoing loudly over the chaos. His platinum Rolex dug uncomfortably into his wrist. Vivian's downfall was less corporate, but infinitely more humiliating. She had just landed at the Charles de Gaulle airport in Paris for Fashion Week, intending to use the funds from the Swiss asset trust her father had left her. She checked into the penthouse suite at the Ritz Paris, handed her black obsidian credit card to the concierge to cover the €20,000 deposit, and turned to admire herself in the lobby mirror. "I apologize, Mademoiselle Whitaker," the concierge murmured, his tone shifting from deferential to deeply uncomfortable. "The card has been declined." Vivian snapped her fingers, annoyed. "Try it again. It is tied to an offshore private trust. Or use the Cayman account routing number I provided." The concierge picked up the desk phone, spoke in hushed French for a moment, and then looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Madam, your bank has informed us that your accounts are frozen pending an international criminal investigation by the United States Department of Justice. Furthermore, the authorities have requested we notify them of your location. Not there." Within hours, Vivian was deported back to New York, stepping off a commercial flight in sweatpants to a swarm of paparazzi shouting questions about her father's illegal empire. The Hamptons estate was immediately seized by the federal government. The modern art collection was confiscated as proceeds of crime. Harlan Whitaker had perfectly executed his final cruelest transaction. He had orchestrated the fraud, hidden the evidence for just long enough, and then passed the entire rotting toxic structure to the two children, who had enabled his worst impulses. They were legally listed as the primary beneficiaries and controlling officers. They were left holding the bag. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Geneva, Switzerland, Audrey sat in a quiet, hyper-secure vault deep beneath the streets. Across from her sat a senior wealth manager named William Hastings, a discreet man whose entire career was built on asking very few questions. Audrey carefully slid the thick watermarked Luxembourg bearer bonds across the table. William inspected them with a jeweler's loupe, checking the micro-printing and the silver security threads. He sat back, his eyes widening just a fraction, the Swiss banking equivalent of a gasp. "These are immaculate, Miss Whitaker," William said softly, reverently. "Fully mature, perfectly legal sovereign debt, unregistered, and entirely liquid. And given the current exchange rates, the total valuation sits at approximately $112 million. How would you like to proceed?" Audrey did not smile. She just looked at the bonds. They represented decades of her father's only legitimate profits, skimmed and hidden away piece by piece. She thought of Preston, currently out on a massive bail that had completely drained his personal savings, facing years in federal prison. She thought of Vivian, who was currently couch-surfing with a former assistant, her socialite friends having abandoned her overnight. "I want to establish a private holding firm," Audrey instructed, her voice calm and absolute. Anonymous, layered through shell corporations, so that my name never appears on any public registry. Call it Underwood Holdings." William nodded, typing rapidly on his encrypted tablet. "And what will be the primary objective of Underwood Holdings?" "Acquisitions," Audrey replied smoothly. "There is about to be a fire sale in Chicago." The bankruptcy auction of Whitaker Logistics was a grim affair, held in a sterile municipal courthouse. The once mighty empire was being carved up and sold for scrap to pay off the legions of defrauded investors and government fines. Preston and Vivian sat in the back row of the gallery, looking like ghosts. Preston had aged dramatically. His hair was thinning. His expensive suits hung loosely on his gaunt frame, and the nervous tick in his jaw was constant. Vivian sat beside him, nervously picking at her unpolished fingernails, her face devoid of the expensive fillers and cosmetics she could no longer afford. They were there strictly as observers, forced to watch their legacy be dismantled piece by piece. The auctioneer began the bidding on the final, most valuable asset, the core logistics network. This included the physical trucks, the remaining legal warehouse leases, and the loyal, hard-working ground staff who had nothing to do with Harlan's crimes. "Do we have an opening bid for the terrestrial logistics network?" the auctioneer called out. A sharp-dressed corporate attorney in the front row raised his paddle. "50 million on behalf of Underwood Holdings." Whispers broke out in the courtroom. No one had heard of Underwood Holdings. The rival shipping companies tried to counterbid, but the attorney for Underwood was relentless, immediately raising the price until the competitors tapped out. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, slamming his gavel, "to Underwood Holdings for 75 million. Preston buried his face in his hands. It was over. The last scrap of their father's empire belonged to a faceless corporation. As the courtroom emptied, the attorney who had won the bid walked directly up to the back row, where Preston and Vivian were still sitting in stunned silence. "Mr. Whitaker, Miss Whitaker," the attorney said smoothly, handing them an elegant, thick envelope, "the owner of Underwood Holdings requests your presence for a brief meeting regarding the transition of the company. A car is waiting outside." Desperate and confused, hoping perhaps this mysterious new owner might offer them consulting roles or a scrap of severance pay. The siblings followed the attorney. They were driven not to a corporate high-rise, but to a beautifully restored historic brownstone in the affluent Gold Coast neighborhood. The attorney led them into a sprawling, sunlit library lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. In the center of the room sat a massive, antique oak desk. Sitting behind the desk, wearing a stunningly tailored emerald green pantsuit, was Audrey. Resting on the desk, polished to a brilliant, flawless shine, and fully restored with a fresh ribbon, was the vintage Underwood Standard typewriter. Preston stopped dead in his tracks. Vivian gasped, covering her mouth. "Hello, Preston." "Vivian," Audrey said, leaning back in her leather chair. "Please take a seat." "Audrey," Vivian whispered, her voice trembling. "What is this? Are you working for the new owner?" "I am the new owner," Audrey said, calmly, picking up a pen and tapping it against her desk. "Underwood Holdings. I bought the physical assets, paid off the back wages owed to the warehouse workers, and secured the legal shipping routes free and clear of the criminal liabilities." Preston's face flushed a deep red. "How? You were broke. You did not even have the money to pay your heating bill. Where did you get 75 million? Audrey gently reached out and patted the cold, heavy iron of the typewriter. "Dad left it to me. I just had to know how to read the fine print." She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a photocopy of their father's handwritten letter. She slid it across the desk. Preston snatched it up, his eyes darting frantically across the page. Vivian read over his shoulder. As they reached the final paragraph, the part where their father admitted to setting them up to take the fall for his crimes, leaving Audrey the untraceable bonds, Preston's hands began to shake violently. "He used us," Preston choked out, the reality of his father's profound betrayal finally shattering his ego. "He gave us a poisoned chalice and gave you the gold." "He gave you exactly what you always wanted," Audrey corrected him, her voice lacking any pity. "You wanted the title, you wanted the prestige, you wanted the illusion of power without understanding the mechanics of how the machine actually worked. You never looked beneath the surface of his wealth to see the rot." "Audrey, please," Vivian begged, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Preston is facing years. We have nothing left. We cannot even afford defense attorneys. You are our sister. You have to help us." Audrey looked at them. She remembered the coldness in the boardroom. She remembered Vivian offering her a little loan as a mockery. She remembered Preston laughing at her inheritance. "I bought the logistics network because thousands of innocent employees were about to lose their livelihoods because of your greed," Audrey said, her tone absolute and unyielding. "I will rebuild this company, honestly, but I will not spend a single cent of clean money to defend you from the consequences of your own arrogance." "You cannot do this," Preston yelled, slamming his hand on the desk. "It is our money. It belongs to the family." "The family is dead, Preston," Audrey said softly. She pressed a button on her phone. "Security will see you out." Two burly men in suits entered the library. Preston tried to argue, but the fight had completely left him. He was a hollowed-out shell. Vivian sobbed openly as they were escorted out of the room, out of the brownstone, and out of Audrey's life forever. When the heavy wooden doors clicked shut, the house fell completely silent. The storm was finally over. Audrey poured herself a small glass of expensive bourbon. She walked over to the desk, sat down, and pulled a fresh sheet of thick, high-quality paper. She fed it into the roller of the Underwood typewriter. The keys were no longer jammed. The hidden safe was empty. It was just a machine again, returning to its original purpose. She placed her fingers on the cool glass keys. With a satisfying rhythmic clatter, she typed out the first official memo of Underwood Logistics. It was time to get to work. Did Audrey make the right call by leaving her siblings to face justice, or should family always stick together? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this story of hidden treasure and ultimate revenge, hit that like button, share it with a friend who loves a good plot twist, and subscribe for more real-life drama.